So here I'm going to outline, this is a timeline for a single patient who could be included in a study. So for a self-controlled case series, which is what we're going to talk about first, this is an observation period. So the green represents the period of time over which we observe a patient. The patient can have the outcome at any point over the observation period. In fact, it's really important that they're able to have the outcome at any time. Okay? We then look over that period of time at when they had the exposure that we're interested in. And we call that the period of hypothesized increased risk of having the outcome. And we can separate that period of time out from the rest of the observation period. So here we've got, where we've just got green, this is our baseline. Where we've got purple, this is our increased risk time, and then goes back to just green, more baseline time. Yeah? What we then do is we look at when the outcomes happened related to the exposures, and the assumption is, or the condition is, that the event definitely happened. So everybody in our study will have both the exposure and the outcome that we're interested in. Yeah? So this is a really important point about this study design. Everybody has both the outcome and the exposure at some point in time. Okay. If the event is more likely to happen during the periods of hypothesized increased risk, then it suggests that there's likely to be a link between the exposure and the outcome. Okay? So that's a brief introduction to the study design. Does it make sense? Are there any questions at this stage? I'm going to talk to you more about some of the detail, but are you all with me so far in terms of how the design works? Yeah? Take that as a yes. Okay. So back to our study question, which is, how does the risk of hip fracture associated with SSRIs compare with tricyclics? Yeah? So this was a study done in what is now the CPRD. It used to be called GPRD. And the study investigators found 16,000 cases of hip fracture. 80% of them were women. And they decided to do both a self-controlled case series and a case control study at the same time. And they found 30,000 matched controls. They were able to extract information on all their prescribing and the major comorbid illnesses, smoking, body mass index, previous history of falls, all of those kinds of traditional confounders that you would hope to have information on. Okay. So these are how the data looked for the case control comparison. So you can see here amongst the cases, we've got 18% exposed to tricyclics and 6% exposed to SSRIs. Amongst the controls, we've got 12% taking tricyclics and 3% taking SSRIs. In their adjusted analyses, what they found was, here we've got for the tricyclics, within the first 14 days of exposure, their adjusted odds ratio was 4.76. For SSRIs, during the same period, it was 6.3. Now, we noticed that the confidence intervals for both of these estimates are quite broad and they overlap each other. But still, the results are consistent with seemingly maybe a higher association for SSRIs, a worse association than for tricyclics. As time goes on, so from 15 to 42 days and over 43 days, this estimate of a harmful association returns towards 1. Okay? So it seems that the risk is increased, especially at the start of treatment, and potentially it's worse for the SSRIs than the tricyclics. So that's the case control results. For the self-controlled case series, this was the design. So they had again in red, the baseline time, both before and after any treatment. And then they've broken down the high-risk period into several shorter time windows. So you've got the first 14 days, 15 to 43 days, the rest of the treatment period while they were receiving prescriptions, and then a short washout period after we think that the patient had stopped receiving treatment, just to separate that time out from the baseline. So remember that the hip fracture could happen at this point, any time during the high risk period, or could happen later on during more baseline time. What's really important to know about this design is that once you've had the outcome, we don't censor you. So the patients who've had the outcome here still contribute the rest of their observation time to the study design. So it's unusual compared to, say, a cohort design where we stop following as soon as people have the outcome. In this design, they remain under observation for the whole period. Okay. So these were the results for the self-controlled case series. So first of all, you've got the tricyclics. And here you've got, in the first 14 days, the rate ratio was 2.3. For the SSRIs during the same period, it's 1.96. And you might notice that the confidence intervals for this analysis are actually narrower than they were for the case control study. This is often a feature of the self-controlled case series, that statistically it can be more efficient. So we can often find that we get narrower confidence intervals in this design. But the other thing to notice is that the effect estimates are lower than they were for the case control design, which was comparing against no treatment. Okay, so I think interestingly here we've got both the fact that the association is more similar for the two types of drugs, and that the effect estimate is lower. Okay. So the conclusions that the investigators came to were that, first of all, antidepressants seem to be associated with an increased risk of hip fractures, and this seemed to be true for both tricyclics and SSRIs. They concluded that the increased risk was higher during the first 6 weeks of treatment than later on. They thought that, in fact, the risk seemed to be similar for both SSRIs and tricyclics, contrary to the results of the study that was in the Lancet. They think that the case control approach may have overestimated the association between antidepressants and risk fracture, and that this was due to indication bias or confounding. And that the difference between the two, between the SSRIs and the tricyclics in the Lancet study, was probably due to confounding that couldn't be handled in that case controlled design. Okay, so any questions about that study before we move on to the next one? Does it? Yeah.
I have a question about that the hip fracture. For example, if from the second time at the hip fracture, is it correlated with the first one? I mean, the before period and during the two kinds of drugs. I mean, before period, do they have some history of hip fracture?
That's a really good question. So this study design can deal with recurrent outcomes if they're independent of each other, and you're absolutely right. So if you've had one hip fracture, your risk of another one becomes greater. So in fact, hip fractures would not be independent. The way that that's handled in this study design is that we only consider the first occurrence. So the condition of being in the study is that you've had at least one hip fracture, and it's the only one that we're interested in. So the fact that you may have a subsequent one is fine. It's not, we're not interested in this. We just want to know the one event which you're conditional on being in the study, when did that one happen in relation to your exposures? Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Easy.
So it's not necessarily a question, it's just a random thought. Maybe depression is, in a way, a protecting factor against hip fracture, because people who are depressed, they're less likely to be active. So yeah, that's a random thought.
No, but this is a really good point. So maybe at the point in time when somebody's depressed, their levels of activity also change, and maybe their chance of a hip fracture changes for that reason. In fact, if following the logic of that, we would then maybe expect that their risk of a hip fracture should be lower while they're taking an antidepressant. Or do you think it was during their untreated depression?
Like when they are not treated for depression, they are less likely to have hip fracture because they are not as active, but especially initially when they were treated for depression. When they were treated for depression, that's why the risk of hip fracture is higher, because suddenly they feel like they need to be active, and then as they were going into more treatment, maybe they're like used to treatment.
I like this is a really good way of thinking. So we need to think about what else can change over time, and you're absolutely right. So things like activity levels may also have changed over time. I think for I'm not a medical doctor, but I think for antidepressants, it can take quite some time for them to have a beneficial effect, and so I wouldn't expect it to lead to an activity change so quickly, but that's exactly the kind of thinking you'd need to do for this study design, to think what else could change over time, because that's really important. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Yeah. Okay. So the thing that really matters with this study design is that, unlike in the case control study where we're comparing against very different people, here we're comparing a person against themselves. And so we are making an assumption that important risk factors are fairly static over the observation period. Yeah? And we'll come back to this later, but keep this in mind. The reason that this is a strong design is because lots of things that differ between people will not differ within a person over the observation period. Some things will, and it's really important that we think about those. Okay.